Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here on this rainy Thursday. I'm Callan Steinman. I'm the head of education and curator of academic and public programs here at the Georgia Museum of Art, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's talk, Activating an Anti-Racist Pedagogy in the Art Museum. Tonight's lecture is presented during an exciting time here at the museum as our newly formed Department of Modern and Contemporary Art has initiated new efforts to interject works by Black and Indigenous contemporary artists alongside our historic collections. Through these in-gallery interventions and related programming and curriculum, like all of us here at the museum are interested in teaching through a more inclusive lens, allowing visitors to consider art through multiple perspectives and expanded narratives. If you've been to the museum over the past couple of months, you may have seen a couple of these interventions on view in our portrait gallery upstairs on the second floor. This gallery is now including works by artists Toki Rome Taylor, Greg Coho, and Kent Monkman on display alongside our colonial portraiture collection. These updates to our galleries have transformed the way I teach in these galleries, the way our staff and our docents teach in these spaces, and have changed the kinds of conversations we are able to have with our visitors of all ages about our collection. Our galleries are open till 9 p.m. tonight, so if you haven't been up to see those exhibitions, I encourage you to go up after our talk to see them on display. I also teach courses in museum studies and art education here at the University of Georgia. A couple of my students are here tonight. And throughout this semester, our class has had a lot of conversations along similar lines, as I've encouraged them to be critical as a visitor to art museums, to consider all of the stories that are included in art museums and museums more broadly, and whose stories are left out in those spaces. And so these are some of the things that are top of mind for me tonight, and why I'm so excited to have Dr. Joni Acuff here to share her work with us. So I'll say a brief word of introduction, and then I'll hand it over to her. Dr. Joni Boyd Acuff is a professor and the chair of the Department of Arts Administration, Education, and Policy at The Ohio State University. She received a BA in photography and a BS in art education and a licensure in teaching art in K through 12. At the Pennsylvania State University, obtained an MA in community-based art education at the University of Texas at Austin, and received a Ph.D. in art education from OSU. Dr. Acuff's research attends to critical multicultural art education, Black feminist theory, and culturally responsive teaching and curriculum development. Dr. Acuff has taught in both traditional and non-traditional classroom settings. In addition to multiple peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, she is the co-editor of the anthology Multiculturalism in Art Museums Today, co-author of the book Race and Art Education, and co-editor of the anthology titled Love Letters to This Bridge Called My Back, which was published by the University of Arizona Press. She is the recipient of the 2017 Mary J. Rouse Early Career Award, the 2019 J. Eugene Grigsby Award for her culturally engaged research, and the 2020 Manuel Barkin Award for her scholarly merit. She was awarded the 2020 Kenneth Marantz Distinguished Alumni Award and the 2021 Diversity Enhancement Faculty Award by the College of Arts and Sciences at OSU. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Joni Acuff.
So awkward listening to things about yourself. Thank you all for being here today. I'm Joni Acuff. Thanks for the invitation. So happy to be here with you all and know that you all are doing this work and invested in making sure that all people have access to the arts. And so, yeah, I'm just glad to be here. I will be reading, and I will say, I told Dr. Hannah Walt this, but I usually don't read, but it's late, and also I'm getting older. And I have a few kids, and my memory is just not that great anymore. So I'm going to read a little bit and try to still be, engaging. So don't fall asleep, please. But yeah, so my presentation, Activating an Anti-Racist Art Pedagogy in the Museum. So as a critical race art educator, I think I would be remiss if I didn't at least address the national assault on critical race theory that's happening in the US at this moment. We've seen politicians and media pundits and school board members and even parents of school children inaccurately, but actually persuasively, misalign racist jargon with critical race theory. As a result of the gross information, I have a clicker, laws and bans have been enacted that restricts the critical and thorough examination of race. And this is just, I put up this, I also have a pointer. I put up this graphic just to show that all the different states that have introduced bans or on watch or actually signed those into law. But those laws and bans have been enacted that restricts a critical and thorough examination of race. But in reality, critical race theory, those bans, they have little to do with actually critical race theory itself. Instead, the ban speaks solely to the objectionable attitudes and concepts that implicate white people in the ongoing racism that people of color experience in this country on a daily basis. For example, the bans prohibit educators from teaching ideas like white privilege or white guilt and white fragility, calling it divisive and a form of scapegoating. And these and other concepts have actually been falsely ascribed to critical race theory. That's not what critical race theory is. Critical race theory actually just offers a framework for recognizing and understanding the ways in which racism and racial bias is pervasive in varying institutions in the US, especially the legal system, which is where critical race theory originated, and then in the educational system. It's a tool for recognizing the ways racism shows up in our lives on a day-to-day basis. In no particular race is outside of that engagement. And so that's what critical race theory is really about. Black American journalist Isabel Wilkerson, author of Caste, this book Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, she helps us see that history offers a critical and necessary lens for understanding the present situation. And she likens colonization, slavery, and indigenous displacement to a house that we've all inherited. When she writes, "We in this country are like homeowners who inherited a house. Many people rightly say, I'd had nothing to do with how this all started. I have nothing to do with the sins of the past. My ancestors never attacked indigenous people, never owned slaves. And yes, not one of us was here when this house was built. Our immediate ancestors may have had nothing to do with it, but here we are, the current occupants of a property with stress cracks and bowed walls and fissures in the foundation. We are the heirs to whatever is right or wrong with it. So we did not erect the uneven pillars or joists, but they are ours to deal with now, and any further deterioration is, in fact, on our hands." So I was invited here today to give a talk, and I decided that this talk would address the ways that museums can take on a pedagogy that's specifically an anti-racist one to support their dynamic and diverse communities with sustained care and awareness. Further, everyone across this country should be seeking to understand the legacies of racism and our shared responsibility to address the problems of the past that lurk within the structures of present-day institutions. But I do understand that many feel unequipped to address racism, especially in institutions whose very conception was built on separating the haves from the have-nots. So I ask you to consider, if you haven't thus far, what tools might museums, museum leaders, curators, educators, practitioners, and staff persons need to be able to innovate and renovate the inherited frameworks and institutions that were built upon a foundation of racism and white supremacy. What knowledge and skills of racism might need to be acquired? And to address this inquiry for this talk, I pulled from my recently published co-authored book, Race and Art Education, to expand on the function of pedagogy. Pedagogy is the practice of teaching, just that simple. It's most often associated with traditional education fields to discuss how K-12 teachers lead learners in curriculum in the classroom experience. However, pedagogy is much more than how one teaches in a classroom context. Education, and thus pedagogy, is enacted in daily practices and habits beyond classrooms in places like the museum. Pedagogy in the museum is not a new concept. I'm not some, rad, innovative person here. Scholar Hooper Greenhill writes, learning in museums is multidimensional. One of the reasons for the power of this learning is that in museums, learning is based on experience. It's performative. Through acting, doing, performing, the deepest learning occurs. In 2001, Charles Garoin adds to this discourse and called for a broadening of museums' institutional pedagogy to include viewers' personal and social knowledge and experiences, to argue for a performative museum pedagogy that repositions viewers as critical participants and enables their creative and political agency within museum culture. Other scholars have since added to the growing literature and theory making. And to this discourse, I would like to include the consideration of an anti-racist museum pedagogy. In our book, Race and Art Education, Amy and I define anti-racist pedagogy as a commitment to understanding and grappling with racism in classrooms and in one's own life as a teacher. And so as I reflected on this definition, it was really easy for me to apply this definition to the museum because these two institutions, schools and museums, have like objectives as places that prioritize knowledge creation and learning. The museum is a classroom and always has been. Even when it was seen as only a repository of objects, it told a visual story. It narrated truths about life, humanity, class, ownership, etc. So whether a human teacher is present or not, it holds objects and artifacts and stories that teach. So Amy and I grounded our model of anti-racist art pedagogy in decades of research and what we've learned from teaching in various communities and in various educational spaces, including the museum. We assert that education is more than acquiring knowledge and self-awareness through human and or object interaction. It's enacted in daily practices and habits. Therefore, we present a framework for anti-racist art pedagogy that we call the 4 C's. These things here, even though it's can't really tell that they are all C's, but I'll emphasize the C words later. The 4 C's, political clarity. All right, let me point these out. Political clarity, protective care, deep connection, and then courageous witnessing. Missed that C right there. These serve as a guide or a compass when we have to make choices about what artists and artworks to feature in the curriculum. When we decide about the big ideas and the enduring questions to use for lesson design. It shapes how to scaffold the development of students' visual racial literacy as they learn to interpret works of art and visual culture. For this context, I see these 4 C's in relation to museum practices similarly. For museum practitioners, the 4 C's serve as a guide or a compass when making choices about what artists and artworks to feature in an exhibition. When the education department decides about the big ideas and enduring questions to use for learning programs and public practices. This framework can help us recognize what additional roles a museum plays outside of exhibiting on walls and teaching in the gallery. How might a museum simply be holding a space for bodies to feel, to exist, and to be still? An anti-racist pedagogy could inform museums on what to provide communities in the wake of events like COVID-19 or the murder of George Floyd or the 2024 presidential election. So let's begin. First, political clarity. So anti-racist pedagogy is grounded in political clarity. So I will acknowledge that right now, even the word or idea of political is scary. This is because it's often associated with the government and elections and parties like Democrat and Republican or Independent or Green. And today, especially after the last week, the word political is one of the most triggering words to be uttered in just about any space. However, this meaning of political for us we thought was too narrow. In our use of the word political, political simply refers to power. We are all political actors. Whenever we make decisions within a group, whenever we use our influence to try to shape outcomes, and when we create systems that allocate resources in ways that express our values, to be apolitical is itself a political choice. It's a choice to be indifferent to uneven power relations in the classroom, in the institution, and in society. So political clarity, on the other hand, is when teachers are aware of the political aspects of education and the way schools reproduce social inequality. But to put this in a museum context, political clarity is when museums are aware of the political aspects of art and the ways museums reproduce social inequality. Think arts access, arts participation, art visual literacy. What strategies have been used to restrict, contain, or abort cultural production and knowledge creation? Museums that desire to take on an institution-wide anti-racist art orientation understand their institution in the context of a larger system of cultural production that is uneven and is inequitable on the basis of race, class, and gender. I'll give you an example of ways museums have reproduced social inequality. This can be identified through the centuries of racism enacted against Black artists, specifically the long-standing rejection of their art, to institutionalize racism in the art world. A tool of coded language, which is a tool of whiteness, has historically helped sustain the objecthood of Black art and Black artists. In the early 20th century, strategies such as critiquing the artistic quality of an artwork or claiming a curator's decision was made on artistic choice allowed white-led galleries and institutions to omit Black artists while saving face. It was very clear to Black artists that racism was packaged neatly within the words used to characterize and reject their art. Scholar Bonilla Silva calls these linguistic tools verbal parachutes. Howardita Pindell she started her career over 6 decades ago and is one of the most explosive artists, activists, educators, and art historians of our times. And she explains that when called out on racial discrimination against Black artists, the response from white establishments used to be, you cannot prove racism when it comes to artistic choice. And as a result of the use of such rhetoric by those in power, an artistic career that resulted in wall space and monetary compensation was nearly impossible for Black artists. Artistic quality had to be acceptable in the eyes of white curatorial staff, gallery owners, donors, board members. Using this seemingly objective language was an exercise of power. Scholar Van Dyke confirms discourse plays a prominent role in the reproduction of racism. This is particularly true for various forms of elite discourse, since the elites control or have preferential access to the major means of public communication, e.g. through political, media, educational, scholarly, or corporate discourse. The narrative that Black artists' work was subpar or specifically did not align with mainstream aesthetic desire, moved effortlessly through the art world and eventually became this master narrative, even to the public. In Pindell's 1988 article, which was titled Art World and Racism, she describes an incident where an organizational group of non-white artists, who were named the Pests, hung posters around New York City that read, "There are 11,000 artists of color in New York. Why don't you see us?" And someone, likely a stranger on the street, responded to the pest's proclamation by writing, "Because you do poor work," on the poster. So language like choice, taste, quality, they work to make racism invisible in the art world. And further, this language functioned just how it was intended to function, which was to relegate them to the margins or exclude them altogether. At the National Art Education Association convention in 2019, Dr. David Driscoll gave a speech during a general session and shared how his work was featured in a big box museum in the 60s, but he wasn't even allowed to visit the exhibition. Knowing this play of power, understanding this play of power, and committing to disrupt this play of power during any decision making in 2024 is political clarity. Museums are actors in the larger educational ecosystem, as visual literacy is the first type of literacy we learn as children. To see images, to read them, to make sense of them, place them in the larger context of society, means that institutions that facilitate such looking, like the museum, they're inherently a key actor in either perpetuating or dismantling inequality. Political clarity enables museums to see themselves and the experiences they provide as part of a larger historical ecosystem, one that has dealt with and struggled for racial and social justice in the arts and through the arts. So museums must tackle questions like, what are the institutional legacies that must be acknowledged and dismantled? And how are we political actors in an ecosystem that sustains oppression? All right, moving on to the second C. Second C is, and actually they're not in any order. It's just the second C I'm talking about today. Protective care. Protective care, I'm not to that part yet, sorry. We hear a lot about care in education, but how is protective care distinct from other notions of care, and what does it mean for museums? Well, protective care is not about creating a colorblind bubble in which discussions of race are avoided. That is neither caring nor is it protective in a world structured by systemic racial inequality. Nor is protective care about saving people. On the contrary, practicing protective care is to safeguard people's potential because everyone needs someone to look out for them and have their backs. What this might look like as it relates to anti-racist pedagogy, I have an example that was really close to home that I can share, and it comes from the Wexner Center for the Arts, which is next door to my building at OSU. The newest executive director, which she's a Canadian Black woman, she had two articles written about her leadership and its impact on the Wexner Center. So this Black woman was hired only a couple of years after COVID closed down the country and the museums around the world. Society was still reeling from the murder of George Floyd, and the museum had recently lost millions in donations from a long-standing fundraising campaign since the departure of the Wexner, which is the center's namesake. So these details are important to understand the status of chaos the Wex was in at the onset of her arrival in November 2022. Approximately 2 years later, a news article about the new director was printed in the August 2024 Columbus Dispatch. Then there was an additional article written about her in the well-known hyperallergic, am I saying that right?
Yes.
Yeah, hyperallergic, in September 2024. And I'm not willing to read from either of the write-ups because of their inflammatory nature, and I will not perpetuate a narrative that questions the character of a Black woman because I know firsthand the implications of that, furthering that narrative, but I will share the headlines, which are here. Low morale and high attrition plague Wexner Center for the Arts. Hyperallergic spoke to current and former workers who alleged staff mistreatment and impulsive decision-making by the museum's director. Fragile finances, staff woes rock Wexner Center for the Arts. So I will share some things about it ultimately. The writings are about the large number of employees that have exited the institution since her arrival in November 2022. The editor of both articles interviewed a handful of disgruntled employees, seemingly the same ones, to build their story about the Wexodus, which they called it. To sum up, this Black woman was described as being cold, dismissive, authoritarian, a bully, inconsiderate, argumentative, non-collaborative, impulsive, irresponsible, fiscally and otherwise. And these are just a few things that really just described her leadership. So this is your case. This is a case study here. In such a case, what does it mean to have protective care in this situation? To enact protective care here, individually and as an institution, there are some critical acknowledgments that must be made. Primarily, let's unpack the language used to describe this Black woman leader. And to tie it into political clarity, which we just went over, I'll revisit Van Dyke's quote about discourse, as it plays a prominent role in the reproduction of racism. But further, let us be mindful of the tropes that have long subjugated Black women in media and in daily life. Mammy, patriarch, angry Black woman, sapphire, independent Black woman, Jezebel, welfare queen. This is all created through the use of the visual, right? Like we're as artists implicated in this creation of these tropes. As a group of people who make up an institution, how might this knowledge about tropes and about discourse, how might this knowledge inform your actualization of protective care? I can't excuse any behavior that may have been disrespectful or lacked decency, but the ways that this Black woman was characterized did give me pause and required a reframing that considered the historical institutions that have made Black women and men caricatures for centuries. Also, practicing protective care requires an empathetic read. Hear that, an empathetic read of others' racial identity. Having an empathetic read of others' racial identity. I just want to repeat that. Some questions that these staff may have needed to consider include, am I cognizant of the ways that Black women have had to navigate positions of power? Particularly, what must the experiences be like for a Black woman taking up white heteronormative patriarchal practices to lead an institution that is an actor in a racist ecosystem? Am I conscious of the acts of personal negotiation that must be happening internally, mentally, and psychologically for a Black woman who's sustaining an institution built on colonialism and racism, but desires to dismantle, to undo practices and policies that perpetuate and sustain that racism? What might this negotiation be like for her? And being a Black woman, myself, and seeing white people perform in ways and excel in ways that are adequate, sometimes even mediocre, but then thinking that I have to work twice as hard to get where I am, and being vetted and questioned and denied time again. This experience, protective care is about recognizing that this experience is not happening in a vacuum. Yes, it's the case that this Black woman is in a particular museum, but it's a part of a larger system of subordination, subjugation, and manipulation that sustains power. Her experience as a leader is informed by other systems of power that she has had to function within and navigate through. So recognizing this is political clarity and protective care. And I'll leave you with these reflections that I wish that those disgruntled employees who were all white would have asked themselves, to activate not only protective care, but political clarity as well. As an actor in this system, how have I fostered a safe space for this Black woman to be vulnerable and rest in her power and recognize that she does not have to perform in ways that she has seen white, heterosexual, cisgender men perform while in power? How have I demonstrated my trustworthiness in an authentic way? How can I demonstrate that I care for her psychological and professional safety? Also, as an actor in this ecosystem, how have I created a space in my own mind to receive and engage with a person whose means of engagement and or leadership might be outside of my comfort level, but very well may be a norm in their culture. For example, this may mean an elevated voice. You may see it as yelling when it comes from a specific positionality. Direct eye contact, you may label it as intimidation. A person being confident in their skills, experiences, and thus decision-making in certain situations. Honest question, do you believe this leader needs oversight at every turn? Thinking about that. Can she not be efficient and self-assured in her decision-making when required, and also transparent and collaborative? Can this Black woman not be multiplicitous and complex? Also ask yourself, have I seen a white man be labeled a leader while engaging staff in similar ways that these employees describe? Probably. And we may have also identified them as questionable leaders. But guess what? This white man will always land somewhere and will likely never be excluded for a job based on race alone, regardless of his disposition. So this is the tension with identity politics. Having protective care allows us to understand that there is power associated with these assessments of Black women, and particularly the professional implications of these assessments are quite different than the implications of similar assessments would be for someone who is not a Black woman. Lama Rod Owen says, we aren't doing enough in our communities to make sure care is centered. How are we creating a community where we deeply care about other people? I don't have to get along with you for us to get free together. Me liking you is not the work, but me loving you is the work. Even in crisis, we need to be gentle with each other. And so this brings me to the third C, which is deep connection. Connection to communities we serve is fundamental to practicing protective care. Although racial identity doesn't determine connectedness, often our connections form organically because we do share common experiences. We share kinship, we share histories. Antiracist art pedagogy in the museum considers visitors, staff, practitioners, educators, curators, etc., not simply as individuals, but also as beings with social histories and cultural lifeways that shape their sense of self, feelings of belonging, and with linguistic behavioral expression. Museums whose practices are anti-racist understand how colorblind ideology and racial inequality shape the contemporary world that they and their visitors inhabit. Moreover, they appreciate that these social and cultural contexts influence visitors differently, and much of that difference can be attributed to the ways in which people and places are racialized. They're attentive to this larger context and therefore have a greater capacity to recognize the full, complex humanity of their visitors. Museums that have done the work to build deep connections with communities are better able to value and build upon and sustain the social networks, the lived experiences, and the worldviews of their visitors. An example of making deep cultural connections and deep cultural and social connections can be seen in this example of Amy Sherrill's experience, detailing the way her artist identity was initiated, developed, and nurtured. In her interview, Sherrill says, "I was always very interested in drawing. I don't even think I knew in the second, third, or fourth grades that there were artists, that people did that kind of stuff. What was so shocking when I first went to a museum was to find out that art wasn't something in a book, in an encyclopedia, that people did art a long time ago. And then when I saw an image of a person of color, it all came together in that moment. That this was something real, that something created this. Somebody created this. Someone who was alive at the same time as I was alive. My art teacher brought me into my own work and helped me understand my own relevance. As much as I was enchanted by art history, I was disconnected from it. It wasn't about me." So Sherrill's experience illustrates the ways that racial counter-narratives in the museum facilitated a connection, helping her to see herself as a potential member of the artist community, thus sparking her art identity development. These counter-narratives help to dislodge old scripts and stereotypes that are hidden within art content that reinforces the association between art and whiteness. For example, if you complete a quick Google search with the key term artist, the image results are overwhelmingly white people. Even search engines that follow the script artists equals white AI in 2024 falls in line with these same racial scripts. The consequences of such messaging are affirming for white students, damaging for students of color, and really distorting for all students. What does this mean for all of us who are seeking to support and nurture artist identities in society writ large? What do young visitors see and feel? Are we taking care of their psyches? Are we taking care of the psyches of our visitors by helping them to emotionally and socially connect to what they see in deep and meaningful ways? So Antiracist Pedagogy's last C is the practice of courageous witnessing. To witness is to remember rather than to hide. Psych, go back. To witness is to remember rather than to hide from history and inherited racial traumas of displacement, enslavement, genocide, police brutality, and other contemporary horrors. At the same time, we bear witness when we emphasize the desires and strivings of communities who experience racism. When we recognize that the creative cultural practices can be testimonies not only to trauma, not only to trauma, but also to the ways marginalized people create joy and goodness and healing, even in the midst of pain and struggle. Witnessing through art can inspire feeling, which can incite learning, but it does not end here. Courageous witnessing is a professional obligation and a course of action that extends beyond the walls of the museum. It calls for museums to acknowledge the truth of people's experiences with racism day in and day out. And it means being present side by side with non-white communities in larger social movements for racial and educational justice. I remember during the racial reckoning after the murder of George Floyd, the Wexner Center opened the doors for the whole Columbus community to gather and mourn. There was no programming, no exhibition, no organization around any activity. It was simply a safe space to witness pain, not to turn away, not say this has nothing to do with the museum. This opening was a key moment for the center to listen and to follow. To be of service to a historically marginalized and dispossessed community was an act of courageous witnessing. Courageous witnessing also includes acknowledging the barriers that people of color experience. Mark Bradford said in an interview, "My background implied that if I went to college, I should major in something that would provide me with a secure salary. I didn't even contemplate going to art school because I felt there was and is a certain class perspective built into being an artist, which I couldn't do because I needed a real job. For many years, I did work a job because that was my social and economic reality." On this slide, you'll see the emphasis we place on the quote. He says, "I hate it when people tell young kids you can do anything you want without qualifying it. Economic, social, and ethnic realities play a big role in young people's choices. These realities need to be discussed almost in conjunction with their artistic aspiration. Museums need to bear witness to these types of experiences, and this is only one example of the ways witnessing can be done. Such a witnessing results in consciousness around and hopefully a proactive strategy to destabilize oppressive structures that impact the arts participation of people of color." So I believe that we come across people, things, information, etc. at the time we're supposed to come into it in our lives. And these interactions are purposeful and they work to activate in specific ways if we take the cues. So this week, the universe has been busy giving me a lot, gems, information, hope to share with you all today. And the first gem that I want to share to sum up my talk comes from Dr. Angela Davis. Last Friday, I recently tuned into a live stream called Love, Power, and Liberation, where Angela Davis, Salama Rod Owens, and Prentice Hemphill were in conversation about moving forward and liberating practices that are grounded in love, especially in times of deep separation. And Dr. Angela Davis says, "If we tackle issues as something we need to handle as individuals, it is utterly impossible. It is the individualism that is always promoted by capitalism that first and foremost we think of ourselves as individuals. And so what if we saw ourselves as, yeah, individuals, but not individuals first and foremost. Instead, first and foremost, we saw ourselves as a community. What if we always thought of ourselves as collective beings first? So not as an individual that's going to have to carry the entire burden, not as someone who will make the process of justice stop when we're tired, but rather as collective beings, as interdependent beings who always work together. So when one part of us is tired, then that part of us rests, and the rest keep going. Capitalism always works against the sense of collectivity, the sense that we are all doing this together, never only by ourselves. And she ended it with, an injury to one is an injury to all. And when I think about anti-racist art pedagogy and the 4 C's, political clarity, care, connection, courageous witnessing, it's an activation of Davis's assertion, an injury to one is an injury to all. Political clarity, care, connection, and courageous witnessing is a framework that is activated by understanding the interdependence of humanity. So on my way to Athens, I started listening to a book. I'm telling y'all, these things kept coming to me. I kept having to add to this talk. But I started listening to this book titled The Hidden Life of Trees. I don't know if you've ever heard that. What they feel, how they communicate. I came across this book in a bookstore last year, and I wanted to buy it and read it, but I talked myself out of it because I don't have enough time to do anything. So I said, I'll leave that for another time. But when I was coming here, I was excited to see it was on audiobook, and so I started listening to it, getting ready to fly here. If I would have known that I would start crying within the first 5 minutes, I definitely wouldn't have started to listen to it at the airport. You ever seen just people crying and you just want to reach out and say, should I? I was that person. Within 5 minutes of the audiobook, the author broke down what it means to live amongst, with, and through each other, which I think is what anti-racist art pedagogy means to do at its core. And he says, why are trees such social beings? Why do they share food with their own species and sometimes even go so far as to nourish their competitors? The reasons are the same for human communities. There are advantages to working together. A tree is not a forest. On its own, a tree cannot establish a consistent local climate. It's at the mercy of wind and weather, but together, many trees create an ecosystem. An ecosystem that moderates extreme heat and cold, stores a great deal of water, and generates a great deal of humidity. And in this protected environment, trees can live to be old. To get to this point, the community must remain intact no matter what. If every tree were looking out for only itself, then quite a few of them would never reach an old age. Regular fatalities would result in many large gaps in the tree canopy, which would make it easier for storms to get inside the forest and uproot more trees. The heat of summer would reach the forest floor and dry it out. Every tree would suffer. Every tree, therefore, is valuable to the community and worth keeping around for as long as possible. And that is why even sick individuals are supported and nourished until they recover. Next time, perhaps it will be the other way around, and the supporting tree might be the one in need of assistance. So I'll end here and share that as I finished fine-tuning this talk yesterday, I sat out on a counter at UGA Convention Center and looked up from my computer only to see this large tree, which made me cry again, in the middle of concrete. And I had to just take a picture because it was startling at first because, for such a large tree to be in the midst of this, man-made landscape, which includes a large building, right? It just seemed very serendipitous for me to be writing about the interdependence of trees and then see this one tree alone in the middle of concrete. I can only think about how long it will survive, how long it will take for its roots to eventually shift the foundation of the convention center. I haven't had time to really process the symbolism, but like I said, it was meant for me to look up and see that and spark more reflection on what consequence will be of being in such isolation when growth and longevity depends on community. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Acuff. We have time for questions. If anybody has a question, we have about 10 minutes remaining. I did ask my students to come up with some, so if any of you want to ask yours, that would be welcome too.
How do you see the future of critical multicultural education in schools now that, in the situation we're in now?
Right, yeah. I talked a bit about this in Saja's class this morning, but I think the act of disruption has always been tough. There have always been moments in history and contemporary where solutions have had to be created for revolutionary work to happen in silence and in collectives, and so. Right now, I don't know what that looks like because everything is such a moving target at moments, right? What I will say is those who are invested in each other and in the love and life of people, all people, regardless of what background they come from, I think that our actions, whether it be how we care for each other in the classroom, how we demonstrate witnessing, being in community with folks, I think it doesn't necessarily have to be cemented in a curriculum. It can be in the way that we engage as people who have these values really settled within their being, right? So, and that's something that can't be taken away from us, the way that we engage and enact love and care for our community as humanity. So, I also talked about making sure that when we think about artists who are introduced in classrooms, making sure they have a very active, their work activates justice. It's not not artists who are on walls who have very kind of passive work, which is sometimes great, but being intentional about the things that our students see, making sure our environment is very active with artists who are doing work that may not be very explicit, but can be you can get it off the internet. I mean, every kid in the classroom got a phone. When they walk in the classroom, oh, who's that new artist on the wall? So just having those opportunities for students to do their own learning. And just you don't necessarily have to be the conductor. So just figuring out how to do that and just having that value within you, I think is something that can't be taken away. Yeah. Oh, okay.
In the readings you have to do in your book, you said that when you first went to a museum, you thought that it was silly that you had to be quiet like we do in libraries. Do you still think that, or is there now a difference of opinion?
It's so strange because I went to the High with my friend who is not an artist, and she doesn't go to museums all the time, and she was talking super loud and laughing, and I found myself wanting to be like, girl, be quiet. But then I didn't say anything because I was like, why? This exhibition brings out a certain amount of joy and emotion, and if that's not what the art was put here for, why in the heck am I walking through here if I can't use my body and my mouth to exclaim the joy that I feel from experiencing these visual engagements, right? So I feel like people were looking, and I was like, and don't say nothing to my friend. She will laugh, and I engaged in it too. But I did feel that still, just based on past trauma of experiencing that, need to perform like a person who engages with art, like this very sophisticated narrative of like, oh, I'm here and I'm holding my hands behind my back and walking like this. You know, not saying like, ooh, look at this and ooh, look at that, and you know, so yeah.
Hey, what was the show?
It was called The Giants. So the one at that Swiss Beats and Alicia Keys, the Dean Collection.
Oh, right.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Kind of piggybacking off what you said when I saw the Giant show, it was just so fun to see everyone like relax and like so many people of color, and it's like I noticed these young girls that were taking selfies in front of all the paintings and stuff, and like one of them was like dressed really provocatively, but she was just having fun. She felt like uploaded to her, socials. And I was like, I just loved how the culture of museums has shifted from like, this very stodgy place to like, yeah, let's take a selfie and wear crop tops and yeah.
My friend did say, why talking about like the guards, why are they not smiling? Why do they look so mean? I'm like, I don't know. Maybe their feet hurt. I don't know. but the curation of that show, I feel like it beckoned to that. Like I think that that's also a role of the curator to create those experiences where some kind of emotion is. It helps you navigate a specific kind of or negotiate a specific type of emotion, right? And so it may be a contemplative one. It may be one of loud cackling, but we should be allowed to be able to rest in that and perform in that kind of joy or engagement if that's what it calls for, I believe. Yeah.
In visiting museums, what would you say, what museum have you visited or know of or sort of recognized as one that captures those 4 C's?
Actually, the museum here, I felt like I've seen some courageous witnessing, and I can't remember that artist's name. Tony?
Koki Brown Taylor.
Yeah, that room where those conversations are happening with indigenous artists and Black woman artists in conversation with, the art pieces that, have historically been centered whiteness, right? I've seen that kind of engagement happen here. So I was happy to see that. I did have something else that Mallory said, and I can't remember it because my brain is really foggy. But yeah, the Wexner Center is really doing work. Like when I say that they just opened the doors, it was no programming, and you had people from all walks of life who were grieving after George Floyd and all the art that was created downtown in Columbus, and the walks and all those things at the museum. That center actually put itself at the center as a space of safety. It was really, new to not seem extractive, like they're wanting to take something from community to but just being there as a space as a holding place for grieving, for the development of joy. You could see like students and faculty starting to create engagements that counteracted the grief, so just holding a space gave them the opportunity to use creativity to, do what they needed to do to navigate those stages of grief. So yeah.
That might be everything.
All right.
Thank you so much for your time, Dr.
Thank you all.
Yeah.